Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. Jake Paul isn't someone that I talk about very much on this channel. In fact, I don't think I've ever made a video on him. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I found out last year that he wrote a book, an autobiography type thing, if you can really call it that, titled You Gotta Want It. It's a weird one, I'll be honest. I want to be upfront about kind of my biases, because often when I go into YouTuber books, you know, like when I've reviewed like Trisha Paytas's book or Lily Singh's book or whatever, I don't really know who the YouTuber is, so I don't really have much of an opinion on them, and I mostly just form it based on the content of the book. But this one, I have to say, going in, I'm not the biggest Jake Paul fan, so maybe that skewed my opinions a little bit. I just want to kind of like throw that out there. I don't have a lot of respect for him as a creator or as a person. I've yet to really see anything that he's ever done and thought, he might actually be a semi-decent person. He's yet to show me anything that proves he has an ounce of respect for any other human being, so yeah, maybe I have some biases. So he wrote this autobiography type book back in 2016, and when I found out about it, probably like 18 months ago, I'm gonna be honest, I didn't have the highest hopes. And I read the book, like I say, probably 18 months, a year ago, something like that, and I had some thoughts at the time, but I wasn't really sure whether I should make a video because not all of it is terrible, I'll be honest. And there are some things we have to think about. For example, he wrote this when he was 19 years old, and I mean, that's nearly 5 years ago at this point, and people grow up and change a lot in those years, usually. So part of me wanted to give Jake kind of the benefit of the doubt and think, well, maybe he has grown or adapted or whatever, but I haven't really seen any evidence of that, so that kind of goes out the window. If anything, I think he's regressed a lot from some of the stuff he wrote about in this book. There are some points he makes in this book that do kind of make him sound responsible, or kind of like he's thinking things through, or that, I mean, not that he's mature, but that he has the potential to mature. And yet his behaviour over the last 5 years since the book came out, no, it just ruins it all. But I actually reread parts of the book again recently because, well, a friend was over and he mentioned Jake Paul, and I was like, you know, he has a book, and then we looked through parts of the book and we had a giggle and it was a thing. And rereading those bits made me realise just how awful some of the parts are where he talks about women. And I started to think about kind of like how problematic that is, especially to be talking about women in that way to your child audience. With all the stuff that I've been talking about recently, like, I've been a lot more vocal about my feminist beliefs than I used to be. And I think it's because I'm not scared of talking about them anymore, which is a positive. And I've realised I sounded really posh then, didn't I? It's a positive. Sorry. Yeah, I think it's really important to show that you don't have to be outright saying, I hate women, to be still talking about them in a negative way. He's very objectifying. He minimises everything a person is down to their looks. And it's lots of kind of like little things that just don't portray women in a good light. While some of the things he writes might not seem bad in certain contexts, you have to remember that he is a 19-year-old man, an adult at this point, with a very large marketing team and editing team and publishing team and his agent, a very large team behind him of other adults who are creating this literal piece of merchandise, this book. They're creating it for children and teenagers. They're very aware of who the target audience is and who's going to be reading this. And they include things like telling single girls to DM him, lists in which he describes every girl he's ever been intimate with and how. He has, like, instructions for kissing. He talks about how hot these 14-year-old girls he knew were. And it's just very odd in the context of who's writing it and who's reading it, you know? Grosses me out a bit. But we'll get to that. We'll talk about it in detail later. We'll look at some specific examples later. To begin with, I actually want to start talking about a few of the positives of the book, because surprisingly there are a few. So one thing that I have to commend him on is that I do think parts of this book were actually written by Jake. Not all of it. It's almost definitely a ghostwriter in there, but parts were written by Jake. And I'm not necessarily saying this is a good thing because he's a good writer. I don't think he is, but it's nice to see him not overusing a ghostwriter in parts. Like, there's at least like 20 pages of this book where I think, oh, I think Jake actually sat down at a computer and wrote this, which isn't a lot out of a 200-page book, but it's something. So The other thing is, and this is probably more commending the ghostwriter than Jake, but I do think that the entire book is mostly written in Jake's tone of voice. They definitely got that spot on. It definitely sounds like him. If you'd handed me this book and said, a YouTuber wrote this, can you tell me who? Jake Paul would have been like top 3 guesses, you know? So I think they got that spot on. I think that's a good thing, yeah? However, some of the parts do seem a little too coherent in comparison with the bits that Jake clearly wrote. So there are kind of like strong tonal shifts that are a little too blunt in places. That is a bit of an issue. And there are kind of like dodgy little bits as well. Like there's this one section about halfway through the book, it's in this chapter titled Haters, and Jake goes on about getting mean comments for his online content and blah blah blah. And after this like long story that's quite well structured, quite well written, quite coherent, it ends with a little like 2 lines that say something like, note, this was a really hard chapter to read, but something ending with a smile, and then he puts like a smiley face. And I'm like, I'm sorry, Jake, this was a hard chapter to read, not write. Which makes me think, yes, Jake absolutely didn't write this, a ghostwriter did. Jake just had to read through it and tick it off and okay it, and that was some kind of mistake they left in the book and whatever. It's weird. Very confusing, very odd. Another positive that I will give this book is that the overall tone is very informal, very conversational. At times, this isn't great because it can lead it to feel unpolished, unedited, a little lazy, a little rushed, but on the whole, where they get it right, and it has clearly been thought about a little bit, I think the tone works really well for the target audience of the children and teenagers, because I think it's going to be very engaging for them. I think it's very easy for them to understand. I think it's very easy to kind of get them hooked on what's being said. And honestly, anything that gets kids and teenagers interested in reading and keeps them reading and gets them excited about reading is a positive in my book. So I have to give a little thumbs up there. Finally, one last positive that I do have to kind of throw in here is that unlike a lot of YouTuber books that I've read, there's at least a good moral to some of the stories being told. Like, there's definitely good little teachings in here for the young people reading it, like messages about working hard and not giving up and apologizing when you do stuff wrong. And I kind of want to take it with a pinch of salt in some ways, because, well, like, let me give you an example, right? So there's one story in here fairly early on about how Jake accidentally offended a nerdy kid, his words, with some Vine video or something like that when he was a teenager. And while the story doesn't quite sit right with me in some ways, because it feels like he's just kind of making up a lot of excuses and being like, well, I didn't do it on purpose, and he's trying to tell the story to be more like, but I didn't actually do anything wrong, but I still apologized. The fact that he has at least put that apology in there, and the story ends with him going to this kid's house and apologizing and taking the video down and saying that even though I don't feel like I did anything wrong, he makes the point of saying, but I hurt this person's feelings and that deserved an apology. The fact that he put that in there, even though the entire story doesn't quite sit right with me, and we'll talk about this in a little more detail later, the fact that he at least included the bits about the apology and how important that is and being considerate for the people's feelings, I felt that was at least a positive thing and something that should be in the book, and they went the right way with that story. And there's a couple of other examples of that, which again, I have to commend, but I don't know if this is just because my standards are set low compared to other YouTuber books. I think compared to other biographies and autobiographies, it's not as good as it should be. And now on to some of the highlights, or maybe rather lowlights, of the bad points of this book. This is a kind of like quick summary if you don't want to watch the whole in-depth part of the video, so I figured I'd put it in here. First kind of point of contention is that it's incredibly cringy in places, especially with his whole like, you just gotta work for it bro message that he tries to put out through this whole book. It's so easy for someone like Jake to be like, yeah, I just worked for it, you know, you can do anything if you try, and stuff like that, when he comes from a place of such like privilege and money, and he had his entire family supporting him, and he had all these opportunities kind of handed to him, and like, I mean, even stuff like having a video camera at his age, huge privilege that I don't think he quite acknowledges. Yeah, so all that stuff is kind of a bit cringy and a bit like, oh, your privilege is showing and that kind of thing. But then again, he was 19 when he wrote it, and we were all cringy and full of ourselves at 19, so you can't really blame him for that. But then again, I have to say, where were his editors, where were his management team, where were the publishers, blah blah blah. So I guess the criticism of the cringe is on their shoulders rather than Jake's. Second point is that in general the book is quite repetitive and it gets a little boring in places. Maybe this is just because I'm not a fan of Jake Paul, and so I really don't care about lines about how he's wearing Yeezy shoes right now. Yup, those are Kanye's. Or that he, and I quote, never liked to cut his toenails. And I really don't care that he once got confused trying to buy plates and in the end decided he didn't need plates at all. He'd just eat out of pans. Maybe real fans of Jake will be interested in this stuff, but for me, wasn't a fan, I'll be honest. Third kind of broad criticism is that some parts of this book absolutely aged like milk. And you read them now 5 years on and you're like, oh, Jake. For example, right on the first page, Jake tells us, you'll never see me at the club. You'll never see me at the late night house party. You'll never see me drinking. You'll never see me smoking. I'm all about that strong work ethic and striving to achieve my goals, all while having fun, of course. And of course this is followed up by, I now play Dirk on the Disney Channel series Bizaardvark, which we all know did not last very long. So for either of those statements, and there's lots of parts like that where he's kind of quite preachy to his audience, and on the one hand, cool for him at the time, you know, instill that good work ethic on your audience, but when you consider his behaviour now compared to when he was writing this, and yeah. My fourth criticism is that so many of the stories, like I said, there are a few that actually have good kind of teachings and morals and interesting little anecdotes in there and stuff, but on the whole, most of them just revolve around, and then I got girls and money. Next, let me tell you about girls and money and designer clothes. Next, let me name drop. Oh, and by the way, girls, 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 money and girls. That's like 75% of the book, and it's not interesting. It's just a little shallow for my taste. I hate to be the old lady in the room, even though I totally am, but I don't think this kind of shallow, materialistic, hot girls, designer clothes, money, money, money is really the best way you should be measuring your success and showing kids that that's how you measure your success. He never talks about any real deep or meaningful relationships. He never really talks about anything deeper than cars, money, girls. It's all very shallow and surface level and, oh, numbers and money and numbers and stats and numbers. It's not, well, I got personal satisfaction out of my work because of this, this and this. It's not, I formed this deep connection with this person because of this and this. It's just, oh, and she was well hot and blonde and she was totally into me, yeah. And like, yeah, I don't think it's a great influence for kids, I'll be honest. Number 5 is, there's a huge issue with how he talks about women and girls. It's incredibly objectifying throughout the whole book, and we will speak about this and look at some examples in more detail. He has chapters with advice on talking to girls and how to date, and they're incredibly problematic, especially when you consider how young his audience is and how influential he is on these children and what they're going to be taken away from it. But like I say, we'll talk about that in a little bit. And finally, number 6 is Jake has never been a mature person. Even now, as a 24-year-old man, he still acts like a child, and that's so apparent in this book. In fact, I think he comes across as more mature in this book than he does now, and that's not really saying much. There's some very jarring passages. It's very odd because you see him at 19 kind of like stepping into adulthood and starting to try and navigate adult relationships and living by himself, managing money, having an actual job and responsibilities, and you see him kind of starting to try and navigate this stuff, but all while having the mindset of a child and not realizing how problematic that is and kind of glamorizing it, and this whole like man-child persona just doesn't sit well with me. So like I say, there's this stuff about not understanding plates and eating out of pans. There's stuff about like ruining the flats that he lives in. There's the way he trivializes very serious topics, the way he just objectifies women and just talks about basically using them for sex. There's like a whole thing of him bragging about how he doesn't clean the kitchen for months on end, and there's like mold and stuff growing. It's very gross. It's horrible. And I don't think, again, it's a very good influence on children. And again, I hate to be the old lady in the room, but this is not the kind of book that I would be comfortable with my nephew reading when he gets a little bit older. I would just be like, no, not at all. You're not reading about a man-child glamorizing sleeping on bean bags at 20 years old and not cleaning your kitchen and making this sound like something aspirational. Like, you're not. No, there's no way to live. Like, I'm all for alternate lifestyles and letting people live however they want and all that kind of thing, but I will never support glamorizing immaturity. That's what it all boils down to, I think. There's your summary, there's my overview. You can leave this video here if you want, that's absolutely fine. But if you want to come on a little journey with me, more in depth, if you want us to look at some specific lines and paragraphs and sections and chapters in the book, we're going to do a deep dive now, because this is what my content's all about. We go deep into these books, we look at specific passages and talk about them and what it means and all sorts of stuff. So that's what we're going to do now. So the first thing I want to discuss in a little bit of detail is how Jake Paul takes from the Lele Pons school of writing YouTuber books, and instead of writing in prose, because that's far too difficult, he reverts to bullet point lists, just like Lele did in her book. And you can actually kind of forgive Jake a little bit more for it, because this is a non-fiction book and you can get away with lists and bullet points a little bit more. Whereas Lele just bullet pointing things in a work of fiction was just very bizarre. But all that said, I still kind of hate it because it's not really used with any purpose or for any effect. It's just out of laziness. It's not because he's trying to make information easier for the reader to digest, it's because he's trying to get it down on paper quicker and just spew it all out there without any kind of planning. The idea of like a bullet point or a list in a book is to make a large chunk of information easier to digest. Give you the main points, highlight the main bits, say there's this, and then there's this, and then there's this, and then there's this. Generally lists have some kind of coherent theme, or then they're numbered, or it's showing you something in order, or it's giving you a large amount of information in a small, manageable in small manageable chunks, and it makes sense. Whereas with Jake, he's like, no theme, no reason, here are some bullet points, they're the first things that came into my head. His bullet points literally include, and this is the opening page of the book, hi, my name is Jake Paul, but you probably knew that. I make funny videos and post them online, you probably knew that too. I'm 19 years old. And as we progress further down the list, we see there's no overarching theme in this list. It's literally just an unedited stream of consciousness with no direction, no purpose, no overarching theme, no point. It's clear he just sat with a Word document and typed the first stuff that came to his mind and then sent it to his publisher. And while doing that can be a really useful writing experiment to kind of get you in the flow and get ideas down, that then needs to be revised and edited and turned into something coherent and useful and informative for the reader. It's not something we should be seeing on the first page of a published book. And I'm going to throw this out there, a little bit of a rant here now, so just going to pop my bitchy hat on for a second. This book was published by Simon & Schuster, who, funnily enough, are the same people that published Gabby Hanna's poetry books. And I have to say to Simon & Schuster, what the flipping flip are you doing? You are giving book writing, publishing, all of it, just a really, really bad name. It is so clear that all of these YouTuber books are just a quick cash grab. No one works with these YouTubers to edit what they're saying or try to like put out any good kind of quality content. It's clear that they just say to this YouTuber, we'll give you X amount of money for 200 pages, write whatever you want, and then these YouTubers fill the pages with whatever crap they want. For example, hi, my name is Jake Paul, and something filler poetry, blah blah blah. And then they're handed a paycheck, Simon & Schuster put it in a pretty little package, throw a bunch of marketing behind it. They don't even need that big a budget because these people already have an established audience, and then they all make a ton of money from it. And it just gives the whole art of book writing a terrible, terrible, terrible name, because it means that all this trash is being put out there and called a published book. I'm sorry, I'm struggling, aren't I? I know, I'm sorry. Mwah. And meanwhile, actual people who care about books and writing, actual artists, people who care about their work, and people who actually care about their work and work for years, decades, to hone their craft, are just ignored and never actually get published when they deserve it, far more than this crap about Jake Paul not cutting his toenails. Clearly, Simon & Schuster, with these YouTuber books, are just trying to make a quick bit of money off influencers and their large audience, and don't actually care about the books they're putting out. Yeah, I just have absolutely no respect for anyone working in this imprint of Simon & Schuster. It's just... bitchy hat off, rant over. You okay? Do you know when we got sad? I'm sorry. I'm sorry, babe. You're such a good girl. What do you think, baby? What do you think? Thank you for caring. I love you. I honestly don't think they even hire editors for these YouTuber books, I'll be honest. Oh, if they do, they barely read them. They probably do one quick spell check and that's fine. Do it. Whatever. So, back to Jake Paul and his lists. This first list includes classic lines like, I'm wearing Yeezy shoes right now, yup, those are Kanye's, and I'm wearing sweatpants, which, I don't know about you guys, but I know definitely makes my life more fulfilled, and I think I'm changed for the better since reading this. So glad I paid £8 for this ebook. We also find out that at the time of writing, Jake does not have a girlfriend right now. Do you know anyone? Footnote. I'm impressed Jake Paul even knows what footnotes are. But, footnote, if you're a single teenage girl, DM him. We also get a bit of an insight into the whole, like, man-child lifestyle, and it bothers me, as I've said before, that this is portrayed as something aspirational. Even though Jake Paul says he's planning on moving out of the place he's currently living in, and I mean, spoiler alert, we know nothing changes from the vlogs he put out over the years since, but he writes, right now I live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Hollywood with 5 or 6 other people, including my brother Logan. It's like an open house. People come in and out all day and night, and it looks like it. Inside there's a huge pile of sneakers. 100 pairs or more. I don't remember how it began, but it's grown into a giant art installation. For furniture, we have a bunch of extra large beanbag chairs. 20 people could crash comfortably, and sometimes they do. The kitchen is used constantly. Cleanup is an issue. I'm staring at a bunch of leftover food on the counter. Don't know what month it's from. You're a 19-year-old man, clean your dishes. This is not aspirational. This is not interesting. This is not a cute, quirky trait. This is a glamorized biohazard. He then goes on to admit that at the time of writing, he doesn't even know what this book is about. It really does just seem like the publishers was like, here's X amount of money, give us 240 pages and we can put your name to it. Doesn't matter what's in them. And then we get onto the actual kind of stories and stuff, and this is where I think Jake's ghostwriter stepped in. One of the first stories that Jake tells in the book is it's the one about needing to apologise to someone over a thoughtless video, the one that we mentioned before. So he's really starting off like setting his tone for his entire career, really, isn't he? Let's be honest. So he opens the story by bragging about being the cool and popular kid in school, you know, like a sports player, and all these people loved him, and he had these videos and people loved them, and blah, you know, the usual stuff. And then he tells us about this video that him and his brother Logan made about, and I quote, a day in the life of a nerd called Barry. And apparently everyone found it funny except someone he actually knew called Barry, which I think is pretty understandable. And Jake tries to play this off as like, we just picked a random name. I wasn't mocking Barry, even if he was exactly like the character. I wasn't mocking him, like, you know, the kind of thing. I've been on the receiving end of stuff like this, and I don't believe Jake for a second. But again, maybe that's my personal biases and my personal experiences coming in and making me a little bit cynical. Jake writes stuff like, as soon as the idea popped into my head, I turned to my brother and said, hey, I'm a nerd, in a dull, nasally voice paired with a dorky face. The name just popped into my head. Logan laughed. The views sailed into the hundreds immediately. We predicted they would soar in the thousands eventually. People talked about the video at school. Everyone loved it. Except for one person, a guy named Barry. He was the kid that many people at school knew and thought of as a nerd. Nothing wrong with that. Us nerds should be proud, stand together, nerd power or something. Yay nerds. Blah blah blah. This intersection of our video, and more specifically my caricature of a nerd and someone's real life, was a really unfortunate coincidence. One that in retrospect was just not cool at all. I know the evidence suggests otherwise, but to this day I swear I did not have anyone in mind when I blurted out the name Barry. Nor did I have anyone in mind when I played a nerd in front of the camera. I was thinking of an MTV show, and that's it. Yeah, I have so many mixed feelings about this, because maybe I'm biased because I've been in Barry's shoes. and I've been on the receiving end of that kind of thing. But also knowing Jake's track record, I don't believe it was an accident, or if it was probably influenced by some unconscious biases, and regardless, it was thoughtless and unkind. On the one hand, at least while talking about this now, Jake manages to point this out by saying that, it's not cool at all, but the whole story feels like he's focusing more on but remember, I'm not actually the bad guy even though I apologized, and like trying to make excuses for what he did rather than actually taking responsibility and properly saying it was wrong. I feel like the point of this story should be, I was thoughtless and hurt someone's feelings, let's talk about it so we can learn from this and not do it anymore, rather than Jake's point, which seems to be, well, I still said sorry even though I'm not actually the bad guy, remember that, I'm not the bad guy, I didn't do anything purposely wrong, I'm not the bad guy. So the poor kid's dad phones Jake's parents, and great job here, thumbs up to that dad, I commend him, it's more than my parents ever did for me, so good on him. Good job, Barry's dad, we love Barry's dad. And the story continues. My dad said, his father said they're going to take it to the school's principal if you don't delete the video. You can't make me delete it, I protested. It's the funniest video we've ever made. I have to confess at that moment, I wasn't thinking of Barry, I was thinking of all the views we'd miss out on. And then this is the part which I actually do have to commend, like genuinely, because I think this is exactly what kids need to hear when it comes down to this story. The video came down, and soon I was sitting in the passenger seat of my dad's Toyota 4Runner, heading to Barry's house to deliver an in-person apology. On the way, my dad made sure I understood the whole situation. Barry's entire family was upset, he said, and no matter what I did or didn't intend, Barry felt bullied and hurt, and so I had to take responsibility and apologise. And that is the bit that is so important in this story, and that I'm very glad they put in, and that I have to commend him for this. Maybe, again, the cynical part of me thinks that it was Jake's ghostwriter or editor or agent or someone who told him to put that message in there, but regardless, it's in there, and that's good, and the kids are reading it, and that's what I like to see. That already makes this book head and shoulders above books by, like, say, Shane Dawson, for example, because that there is an important lesson, and I'm glad it's in there. Sadly, he ruins it a little bit with the next paragraph, which says, I've never been in as much trouble, but I knew the truth. I'd never bully anyone intentionally, and I certainly hadn't tried to bully Barry. In that moment, though, it didn't matter. I'd hurt someone else's feelings, which isn't okay, and I knew I had to make the situation right to rise to the occasion. It's like this kind of sandwich. It's like, great moral lesson, Jake defending himself for being a douche, great moral lesson, and they kind of start to cancel each other out a bit, which is really frustrating, and I'm like, you didn't need to include that middle bit, okay? Just scrap that and go to the apologies and lessons. That's all we need. Again, though, the chapter does end on a really commendable note, saying, hindsight is 20/20, and looking back now, I see I had some growing up to do. Even though I didn't want to do it at the time, I was forced to learn a lesson, and I'm grateful for that lesson today. Actions have consequences. None of us live in a bubble where our wants and whims are all that matter. Put a check by that box. I didn't leave Barry's house an angel. I was still a kid, newly minted teenager, and I was still going to mess up a lot. This is what I want to read in a book by Jake Paul. This is exactly it. Perfect, spot on. If only the book had ended there, if only he'd managed to keep living his life by this, we'd all be good. Everything would be better. But that's not what happened, is it, Kuber? It's not what happened, is it? So, we get that one pretty great moment, that one chapter, that works, and then we're back to the more vapid content, unfortunately, aren't we, Kuber? Yes, aren't we? And the stuff that Jake clearly wrote himself, like the chapter titled The 5 All-Time Funniest Zoosh Videos, which is hard for me to say. There's too many S's and Z's in there, and it's not very good at saying my S's. S's. They take a lot of thought for me. It's hard. This funniest Zoosh videos. It's probably one of the hardest things you could ever get me to say. Don't ask me to do tongue twisters. No. I had a lot of issues learning to speak as a kid with, especially like getting my S's and sh's and sk's and s's and so on. I really struggled pronouncing them for a long time, and I still do. So talking isn't my strong point, I'll be honest. Anyway, the point is, chapters like this, while they don't interest me, and they are just a bit of an ego boost for Jake, I don't really have anything against them, because I think for a die-hard Jake Paul fan, they'll actually be quite interested in this stuff, and it seems like a good addition for them. And then we move on to Jake getting interested in girls, and this is where I start to have the really big problems with the book. It starts with him dedicating a whole chapter to how Megan Fox was his first crush, because, and I quote, "She was the hottest girl in the universe. At that age, I knew the word sexy, but not its meaning. I can't say that I walked out of that theatre thinking Megan was sexy, but I did walk out of that theatre thinking about Megan." Not the deepest thing I've ever read, typical teenage boy stuff, kind of pointless to include in this book, but honestly, the least problematic thing he writes about women in this whole book, so I'll give him a pass. He immediately follows this up with a chapter titled Hello Ladies, in which he writes that in 8th grade, I started to think about girls non-stop. It was like a light turned on in the otherwise dark room known as my brain. And he literally includes a whole page in the book saying, girls, 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 over and over. Literary genius. I can see why he got a book deal. He then brags about how at age like 14 or 13 or something, so many girls liked him. And then he says, I had a secret weapon to assist me in this new adventure. A cell phone. Though my parents gave it to me in case they needed to get in touch with me or I need to get in touch with them, in reality this new cell phone of mine became a digital pipeline to every hot girl I liked. Within the first 2 days of having it, I was texting 10 girls from my school, and they actually texted back. Make fun of me for what I'm going to say next, but it's the absolute truth. My pants buzzed non-stop, day and night. At one point, I asked 3 of them to be my girlfriend. That's not a cool thing to do. I know. Even less cool, I asked all of them in the same week. I made out with 2 of them in the hallway at different times of day. They all found out and were pissed. Now, have you guys heard of the Bechdel test? Because I can guarantee this book would not pass. What do you think? You a fan? As Jake talks about this awful thing he did, cheating on women and using them or whatever, he reverts back to this, I did something bad, but it wasn't my fault because reasons. You know, like an absolute child. He says, I was both guilty as charged and completely innocent in terms of intent. I just got caught up in the whole girl scene and went too fast for my own good. And then this is the really weird part where he, a 19-year-old man, tries to explain what 12 and 13-year-old boys are thinking about sex to 12 and 13-year-old children. It's just a little uncomfortable to read, both as an adult and a woman. I can't quite put my finger on why this makes me feel so grossed out, but maybe you guys can let me know what your feelings are. Listen, experience this and tell me your thoughts. At a young age, girls wonder where babies come from. Boys don't. We just accept that there are babies. Then around ages 11 or 12, girls start wondering not where babies come from, but how they're made. Boys don't get to this stage until a year or 2 later, as I did, and then we simplify the question to this: what's sex? Sometimes you get a talk from your parents. In my parents' day, it was referred to as the talk. From what I understood, it was awkward. It was basic, and then to the relief of everyone involved, it was over, done. The talk was checked off the list, and life turned into a ticking time bomb of curiosity and anticipation. For our generation, people like you and me, don't include me in your you and me's, Jake. No. I'm only 4 years older, but for people like you and me, it's different. We don't get the talk or need it. Yes, you do. If this book is anything to go by, you need it, Jake, and you still need it. All we have to do is call up Google on our phone or computer, type in a word or phrase or a question, and we get the answer. Or we get way more than we bargained for, which is what happened to my friends and me when we got curious. This was all my pubescent pals and I did for a brief moment in our young lives, and what an education we got. Through photos and videos, we figured out the basics on our own, and then some. And we were good to go. No talk necessary. So basically, he's saying to his young child fans, just go watch porn. You don't need actual sex education. Porn. I mean, this is like an awful influence and an awful thing to teach kids in its own right, but it also explains so much about Jake's attitudes towards sex and women and his lack of respect in general. Explains a lot. And then he goes through and lists each young girl he was intimate with and lists them by name and tells his child fans everything that happened between them and how he ended up cheating on 3 women at once. Lovely. Is anyone else grossed out by this? Jennifer, one of the popular girls. She was blonde and had an athletic body. Exactly my type. She was the first girl I ever made out with. We had a crush on each other at a time when both of us were still in that awkward boy-girl stage, and we flirted by text. We walked to the bathrooms together in total silence. There was a men's room, a ladies' room, and a room marked family. We stood out front for a moment, and then, without ever discussing it, we walked together into the shared family bathroom. The door shut, and we stood directly opposite each other. Then we made out. It was really awkward, in a really wonderful way. And after a few minutes, we walked back outside, acting like it never happened. Then, a week later, I asked her out. And by out, I mean if she wanted to walk, Crocker Park, and hang out with me. The implication being that we could make out again. She said yes. Without ever discussing it, we made out. It was really awkward. Because who needs to teach kids about the importance of consent anyway? He then goes on immediately to talk about Michelle. She was blonde and had an athletic body. Exactly my type. Are you seeing a pattern here? She just looked sexy. She was the first girl who made me stop everything and go, wow. So did Julie. Who's Julie? Julie. She was a brunette and had an athletic body. Exactly my type. She also had boobs. Is anyone else grossed out by an actual adult man talking about these like 13-year-old girls in this way? So he ends up dating Jennifer and Michelle at the same time because he's not communicating with them and only thinking with his penis. Meanwhile, he admits that he was, and I quote, also texting Julie and her boobs. I was into making out, but I'd heard that others were doing more than kissing, including Julie. I didn't know exactly what she'd done, but thanks to Google, I'd figured out the facts of life and then some. So let's just say my imagination was filled with possibilities. Some that seemed potentially realistic, and other scenarios that were beyond comprehension. It's so disgustingly objectifying. Women aren't just objects you can play with and pass around based on who's most likely to touch your pee-pee. And the gross part is that Jake was doing this as like a 14-year-old boy, or however old he was, 13, 14, something like that. He was doing this then. He's doing this as a 19-year-old man, and he's doing this to this day, apparently, so gross. And now he's teaching other kids that it's okay to do this as well. He then describes to his child audience, Julie and I went into my room together and made out. Then after a while, her hands went places and so did mine, and suddenly we were past making out, in brand new territory. At least for me, I was like, oh my god, this is the best moment ever. The cool thing is that that moment is still pretty great. All these years later. This is so gross for an adult to be writing this for children. And I mean, yeah, teach kids about sex education, teach them in an educational manner, teach them about consent and what's appropriate and respecting your partner and all that other stuff. Educate them, speak to them about it, normalize it, destigmatize it. But bragging, I got a handjob from a 14-year-old while dating 2 other 14-year-olds, isn't appropriate. Oh, and by the way, I'm 19, but that was still one of the best moments of my life to this date. Not appropriate. He then brags that when the girls found out about this, apparently, all said relatively the same thing. Wow, you're a player. Player. That was the word to use when you wanted to call someone a 2 or 3 timing cheater, but not a dishonest cheater. More of a fun-loving cheater. Someone who was unable to resist asking for seconds or thirds. I'm gonna vomit. They said you're a player, and I was. They were pissed at me, though only for a couple of weeks, and then it wasn't like we might never ever get back together again. They just didn't care anymore. But I did, because suddenly I had a reputation, and it spread across the whole school. From then on, whenever I texted a girl, she replied hesitantly, people tell me you're a player. How the hell can one man be so thoughtless? And it gets worse in the next chapter, which is titled, 10 Facts About Teenage Guys That Every Teenage Girl Should Know. He literally opens with the creepiest line ever from an adult talking about 13 and 14-year-old girls, which is, while girls are occupied with their hairstyles, clothes, and shoes, and maybe cool rings and necklaces, most guys in the 8th grade are thinking about what girls look like after all that's removed, and they're in their underwear or bathing suits. They probably don't notice anything more than the colour of a girl's hair, if that. By 9th grade, guys are obsessing about what girls look like without their clothes on. Guys at this age may sleep through social studies and look confused in math, but they can tell you the name of every girl in junior high who has started to wear a bra. If you need a translation, I see all women in my life as objects and only think about how I can use them for sex. I assume all men are also like me. Girls, you should be begging for us to notice you and your bodies and maybe your hair colour if you're special. He goes on and says, if a guy does like you, play a little hard to get, kind of tease him, put him down a little without putting him off. For instance, say, those are nice shoes, did your mum dress you? Then pause and add, well, even if she did, you still look cute. Translation, I, Jake Paul, often neg girls, and I'm going to pretend it works the other way around too. He then tries to pull it back by being all like, but really the most important thing is just that you're yourself, you're just you, and it just feels so performative and disingenuous after everything he's written in this book and his actions in public and everything. It just, I mean, yes, Jake, it really sounds like you liked Julie for who she was and just being herself, and not because, in your words, she had boobs and you'd heard she'd done more than kissing. What a well-rounded woman. You described her so well. I feel like I almost know her myself. Julie with the some-coloured hair and the girl bits. He then moves on from women for a bit to complain about school, and he goes from bragging in one chapter about how he was so popular in school and got all the girls, to in the next saying that every day of high school was the worst, and he says that simply because he just wasn't interested in classes. And then we get a story about him stealing iPhones to impress some kids. So it seems like peer pressure is a huge problem for Jake. He just can't say no. This still seems to be a problem. In the later chapters, he starts to kind of like get a little bit more popular on Vine, and he starts name dropping someone called Kelly Stewart, who was like in some beauty pageant or something. And again, the way he talks about her throughout like 3 chapters is so objectifying. It's all physical, nothing about who she is as a person. Let me give you some highlights. Kelly was tall and blonde and beautiful. There was nothing unawesome about her or about the idea of hanging out with her for the 4 days of the tour. I found pictures of her on the internet. Not a difficult thing to do. I hadn't been able to stop thinking about her. She was the hottest girl I'd ever seen, and she was famous. Verified on Twitter. Towards the end of the VIP meet and greet, she got there and I had one thought. Oh my god, she's perfect from head to toe. Up close, she was even more beautiful. I'd never seen a girl that pretty. It threw me off my game, which has never happened before. She noticed the way fans were going crazy over me, and I could see she was impressed. And then apparently they flirt a little bit, and later that night, Kelly texted me, I really like you. You're awesome. I replied with a similar message and got a response, though not the one I expected seconds later. There's just one problem. I'm kind of talking to this guy, and I was like, oh, whatever. I didn't care. I'm going to text you anyway. Her reply was short and sweet. Smiley face. So clearly Jake has no respect for this woman's boundaries. He doesn't even say anything about her other than she's tall, she's blonde, she's beautiful. She's verified on Twitter. That's a personality trait, apparently. And then in another chapter, though we hadn't seen each other since January when I was last in Texas, we texted multiple times daily and considered ourselves to be talking. Why is that a thing? Which was more committed than I'd ever been with a girl. Then again, she wasn't just any ordinary girl. Not with that long blonde hair, sculptured features, and sparkle in her eye. The fact that this girl stood 5'10" and was prettier than any model I'd seen in magazines threw me off my game. I also cared about her in a weird way I didn't know how to deal with, since it was the first time that had happened. Plus, despite all the texting and talking we'd done the past few months, it was awkward seeing her in person. So once again, I should mention we're now 3 chapters in that she's been mentioned and spoken about, and I know nothing about her personality, her interests, her character. Apparently, blonde and hot is all we need to know. And then he writes about them kissing, and he gives a list of do's and don'ts for first kisses, which again, kind of weird. And so then they talk a bit more, but then they don't see each other again because Jake is totally focused on social media or something like that, and it's all just very, very odd. Literally the only point of this whole story is to brag and say, look, I hooked up with this totally hot and slightly famous woman. Be impressed, children. Throughout this whole book, he literally only ever writes about women as commodities who are there to boost his ego or make him look cool or for him to have sex with. He also includes a chapter on first date advice, which is clearly written by a cis white man, because it includes stuff like, go somewhere private, like a hike in the middle of nowhere for 3 to 5 hours and don't tell any of your friends that you're there, which a woman could never do. Yeah, I'll just go somewhere with a strange man who could easily rape and murder me and not tell anyone where I'm going because I want to seem mysterious to my friends, and that's far more important than my safety. Women can't do that. Then there's some chapters about Jake actually putting some work in, which are all really good, and I have to commend them. And then we get one about him moving to LA with Logan, and we get more of his odd man-child behaviour and a lot more of objectifying women. So, listen to this bizarre story, which has no point other than to say, lol, I'm a child who can't look after myself. How funny and relatable. Which, to his audience, it probably is, since they are actual children who can't look after themselves. I'm going to wager, though, that most of, well, no, probably not Jake Paul's audience, but most people the same age as Jake Paul's audience, I'm going to wager that most of them can look after themselves better than Jake Paul can. I have some teenagers in my audience, and a lot of them have their heads screwed on, very mature, very put together, like the opposite of Jake Paul in this book, I'll be honest. So it's not really an age thing, it's just a maturity thing. Anyway, we went to the store to purchase a set of plates, and we were immediately confused. We found some labelled dinnerware, but didn't know if there were different sets for lunch and breakfast, or whether tableware was for every meal. It was confusing until a salesperson set us straight. Plates were plates. See, don't ever say Jake Paul doesn't impart wisdom on you. Life-changing wisdom. Okay, so with that in mind, we found one set of 6 for $20.99 and another set of 10 for $24.99. We debated one set versus the other, as well as how much money we should be spending on other essentials. Finally, I told Logan that I had an idea. What if we just get one plate and share it? You eat with it, then wash it off, then I'll eat with it and wash it off. That could work, couldn't it? Why do we even need plates, he asked. Why can't we eat out of the pot? Because Mum wouldn't... I stopped mid-sentence. You're right. Why do we even need plates? Oh my god, I just can't. How did this get published? How? Oh. I know, Coob, I know. Even you need a plate. Even you have your bowls, and you're a little animal. An animal. And with that bizarre story, we move straight on to objectifying more women. For example, we lived above a health food store that was a hangout for actors and models. Everyone was hot. No, that's not really accurate. Some people were super hot. One day I noticed a brunette in workout clothes hurrying down the hall. Is that? I asked my brother. That's her, he nodded. And that's the way we got to know Amanda Cerny, the former Playboy model turned Vine star and actress. Logan and my dad had met her when they were looking for apartments, and now she lived 2 floors below hers. And besides being super gorgeous and hot, she was hilarious on camera and off, and really nice, and that was my air freshener going off, sorry. So, this is the first woman in the book who actually has more personality traits than gorgeous and hot. We also have hilarious and really nice, which again isn't really saying a lot, but yeah, it's just not really saying a lot, is it? And then, back to being reductive again, he phones his mum up and says, "We moved in and live above a Playboy playmate!" Once again, Jake is reducing woman down to her popularity and her sex appeal and nothing else. He then has a chapter titled 10 Thoughts I'm Having Right Now, which includes some life-changing philosophical statements I think you'll find. For example, who wants to go to dinner with me? That's number 1. Thought 2 is black bikinis. Thought 3 is always ready for the gym. Let's move forward a little bit. Number 6, I wish my truck had wings and could fly. And of course, the groundbreaking statement, number 9, thumbs up to friends. How was this ever published? It is a mockery and insult to every hard-working writer out there, I swear. And then we get to the chapters about Jake and his friends being irresponsible children and destroying property in the places they live with no remorse and no concept of consequences, and it is actually infuriating to read, even more so knowing that he only gets worse after this book was published. He writes, "Our apartment was a pit. Things didn't get put away as much as they got put someplace. Clothes, socks, various tennis shoes, video equipment, and whatever props we dragged inside, they were all strewn across the floor, set on shelves, deposited on furniture. We treated our place like a set, and nothing was off limits or too crazy when it came to getting the shot we wanted, as was evident by the holes in the walls and scuff marks across the floor. Amanda taught us to eat healthier. When we first began hanging out, she was shocked by the way Logan and I ate, or more specifically by what we ate. At the time, our diet consisted primarily of chips, pre-workout power drinks, and occasionally fast food when we needed a real meal. This isn't funny or cool, it's just gross and immature. And then Jake writes a few actually decent chapters about going to acting classes, focusing on the business side of things, and it actually seems like he's really imparting some decent knowledge on these kids and some good values about working hard. And it seems like a really good thing to teach kids until you realise that the minute this book was published, he threw all that stuff out of his own life. And like the year after he wrote this book, he like quit his acting stuff. He just started acting like more of a child. He even like screwed over a lot of the business side of this. And now he's just drinking and doing drugs and sleeping around and being a bit of a menace. And I know he's got his like boxing thing or something going on. So maybe he is kind of pulling it back a little bit now, I don't know. I haven't really been following him since he started the fighting thing because it doesn't interest me. So maybe he is getting better now, but in the immediate years after writing and publishing this book, he just kind of threw out all this advice he's trying to impart on these kids, so it all just feels quite fake and pointless, and it's a bit frustrating, I'll be honest. Like, he undermines the only decent parts of this book with his actual life. And then he begins to talk about forming Team 10 and meeting Alyssa Violet, who he describes like every other girl in the book. She was my type, way hot and really weird in a funny, relatable way. He literally could just be describing the same girl each time. And then he's like, I wanted to make her famous, so I did. And then he starts moving on to more name dropping with people. I don't even know who these people are. Maybe it's because I'm old in English, but he's like, our neighbours were a who's who of famous influencers, including Amanda, Curtis Lepore, Rudy Mancuso, Cameron Dallas, Lance Stewart, and others. In this one building were about 20 people with more than 100 million followers collectively. It was exciting, maybe if you know who they are. And then the rest of this book is him talking about his Disney work, his workout routine, a list of things he thinks are good, and then 5 ways to get more followers, and that's about it. And I don't really have a lot to comment on that stuff because this book is exhausting. And that's it. So, overall, in summary, what did I think of this book? Well, there are some slightly decent points in it, which sadly he undermined in his real life, like I said, after this book was published, and I don't think Jake is directly responsible for the good, valuable content in this book, sadly. Overall, the book feels like a cheap, quick cash grab, which is exploiting children and teaching them horrible things about sex and dating and how to treat women and just how to live your life and how to be an adult. So honestly, I would not want the target audience of this book actually reading it. I think it's a really bad influence. I would not want my niece or nephew reading this. I would not want my niece being treated in the same way that the women and girls, young girls, I would not want her being treated the same way that the ones in this book are. It's revolting. So yeah, up and down, not the worst YouTuber book I've read, but one of the worst books in general I've read. So there's that. But I would love to hear your thoughts on this, and let me know what you think of Jake Paul in general, what you think of this book, if you've read this book, how you think it kind of ties into Jake and his life. Like I say, I haven't followed him since he got into the boxing stuff, so maybe he has turned over a new leaf and got better, and you can tell me some of that stuff down in the comments. Otherwise, I'd just like to hear your thoughts. Oh, one more shout out before we leave is, I want to say thank you to the person who sent me this amazing Fraggle Rock t-shirt, reminding me to dance my cares away. Love Fraggle Rock so much. Again, probably because I'm old. But yeah, thank you to the person who sent me this. It was on my Amazon wish list, and you sent it me for my birthday, and I absolutely adore it. And I know I said a thank you to you on Instagram, but here's another public one because it's amazing. Thank you actually to everyone who sent me little bits for my birthday, and little bits for Kyra as well for her adoption anniversary. We really appreciate it, and you're all wonderful, so thank you. And yeah, that's us done for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again very soon.